Hey guys, we're here with a demo and it's for an environment concept, and this whole process took about approximately 4 hours. I've sped it up of course to about 20 minutes. As usual, I'll give myself some direction. Envision a scene for a third-person shooter, futuristic military based on Earth, and it's like a resistance movement heavily inspired by Hoth on Star Wars, that winter scene in Black Ops, Project Destiny, and that sort of idea. And so we start off with some thumbnails for layout and composition. And this is an important step that a lot of my students tend to kind of skip, and they'll just pick one little layout and kind of go with it. And what you don't want to do, and especially with concept and design, is just limit your choices. Even if you flesh something out to completion with fully rendered and all that, it can never be as good as it could be without generating a bunch of ideas. Here you see me kind of showing the rule of thirds. This is a good starting point for learning composition. You take either the upper right corner as your main focus and the lower left corner as the secondary, or the opposite. And this is a good starting point, especially if you're not familiar with putting together a sound composition. And you can kind of deviate a little bit from there after you get comfortable. And so you see I've done a number of different layouts here, and I'm exploring different ideas and camera angles and setting up a scene with a bunker and maybe some tanks and that sort of thing, mountains and cliffs. The other thing you notice here is I'm zoomed out, and again, even though it's digital, it still feels like a thumbnail, because at this magnification you're forced to only deal with major shapes and simple details without getting too zoomed in and too focused on details too early. Another approach you can do here is, you notice I've kind of taken bits and pieces of thumbnails and seeing how that can work to either push an existing example or composition or create a new one from older parts. And that's just another approach that you can explore as well, and definitely an advantage when doing this sort of work digitally. Okay, so you see me here just kind of also testing different, flipping the image and shrinking some of the pieces and adding to it. Again, there's a lot of different ways in how you can approach this, and there's no right or wrong. It's more like what is correct or best for that situation or that circumstance. Here I am just continuing on. So once we find a layout that you're happy with, now you see me going in and sort of fleshing out the ideas a little more with a more detailed sketch. It's still very loose, still very much just kind of feeling things out. And this is the process that's actually the most fun, because you're not worried about making everything perfect. You're just playing with ideas and as they come and experimenting. It's kind of like doodling and writing your notes on a memo. Okay, so with this demo, like the previous one, I'm trying to show at least different options how you can approach it. So you see here I'm going back and forth between sketching and now going more with base tones and values and silhouettes, and I'll flip-flop back and forth. And sometimes I do approach it that way, sometimes I stick mainly to sketching and lines, other times I stick mostly to paints and tones. It really just depends on the subject matter, what you're trying to achieve, and what you're feeling at the time. Really that's all it's about, is all these different tools and techniques to help you get to your goal. And a lot of times you're just building up on what's already there, so it's back and forth. You saw me do a sketch, and now doing tones, and then putting the opacity down, and then laying down more details, and I'm just feeding off the information that's there. I'm just reacting to what's been laid down beforehand, similar to my past demo about making guns and things like that. And along those same lines, you see me repeat some shapes and utilize it and add to it. And again, that's the symmetry and that kind of aspect is appropriate for buildings and tech and anything inorganic. But you still have to be careful about not being too repetitive, because things will start to look stale, and you don't want that ever to come across when you're designing something, especially in the case of anything that's non-reality based. So if you've seen my gun demo, you'll notice something familiar here, and it's working from a profile view, which is very common because it's an easy, quick way to put across a lot of information for design for weapons. And I'm doing that for, in this case, for the cannon on the tank. And if I left it more of a sketch, then that's perfectly appropriate with all this extra information. You'll notice later on I'll start to color, and I'll start to rather paint and render, and maybe some of the details get lost, but that's okay, because again, you're working loose and quickly, and you're playing off the information there. Even if it's just kind of subtle and implied and hidden in areas, it's still extra information that's achieved very quickly with full effect. Okay, so kind of adjusting proportions, and again, you notice I'm not too concerned about it looking too messy. You know, I'm kind of lassoing areas and cropping them, and adjusting the perspective and tones by adding more paint. And you're just trying to get an idea across. You know, it's not really about polish. That kind of thing can come much later once design is finalized. But it's how can I get across a lot of information and design, atmosphere, and story, what have you, in a quick amount of time. So here I'm kind of playing with the overall scale. And kind of adjusting where I feel there needs to be a little more breathing room. And I do that more than once actually throughout this demo. Again, a handy process in repeating shapes and ideas. So you saw me take that initial main tower and duplicate that, push it in the back, and add more information, different buildings to it. Again, it's a quick way to get some more ideas across, but still adjusting where you need to so it doesn't look too sterile. And here I'm kind of flip-flopping between working with the tones and building up values as well as details at the same time. Just adding kind of extra atmosphere and ambiance. And so you never want to have any dead space, and it should always feel intentional. So I left that sky open knowing that I was going to place some ships there. Additional background mountains. It's really quick, you know, going between using your brush and your lasso, sketching, values, all these different things back and forth. Just keeps things very fluid. Also keeps things interesting. You don't want to get bored, and you don't want to get focused on one area. You kind of want to move around and go back and forth. And really just, it's very much reactive. You're just going with the flow and testing out how things feel. So here is a case where I had a lot of lines in there and they were very dark, so kind of pushing back the opacity and the saturation allows me to keep some of those lines without it being too sticking out too much, and I can always paint in edges with darker shadows, and that will have that same sort of contrast without it relying too much on the actual previous dark lines that were there. So once you feel you have enough information and your values are set, you can start playing and working around with color. Color theory can be a challenging thing. It's still a challenge for me at times. So definitely you want to make sure your values, your level of shadow from white to black are all set in place before you attempt any color. There's a simple exercise I'll show my students where I'll take two squares, a red and a blue, and you know, at first glance it seems like, okay, I can separate those two images because of those colors, but those who have painted for a while will be able to tell whether the values are good. And what I'll do is I'll make sure each of these, the red and the blue, are the same value, and so when I grayscale it, those two squares blend into one gray rectangle, and then students will realize how values comes into play and not to be fooled by color. And then by making the red lighter and the blue darker, what happens is they're separated not only by color, but then when I grayscale it, you can tell because one square is darker than the other. It's the same thing across any kind of design or image, and certainly the more elaborate your paintings are, values really have to be pretty distinguished. And so it's pretty monochromatic at this point still, but now at least I am working with that palette to use shades and lines and details, and I'll start to add more color as we go forward. Revisiting some ideas for the cannon on the tanks. And as things get further along, they become more crystallized because you have a lot of ideas to play off with there. The most daunting thing, as always, is a blank piece of paper or a white slate. And really what you're trying to do is just build up the ideas and information, and the more you lay it down bit by bit across the whole page, the more confident you become with your image, the less daunting it becomes, and the more clear and defined your ideas become. It all starts with just general shapes, silhouettes, and from those silhouettes they get broken down into smaller silhouettes within the larger one, and then that gets broken down to details and designs and shadows and tones, and you keep going back and forth, and it's just kind of this ever growing process. Okay. Sometimes you'll see these images from impressive images from these AAA games and movies, and you look at it and go, how did they get to that point? Well, guaranteed they, in a similar fashion, they just built it up gradually, and the more information they laid down, the easier it was to add more information as they pushed forward. So I was just mentioning there that adding some figures accomplishes a couple things. It gives you scale and idea of distance and size of objects, as well as giving a story element and something to relate to. That's the key thing, is if you pick shapes or ideas that we can recognize in the real world, like a tank or aspect of a gun or what a tower encompasses, but adding some kind of figure or person is really what helps communicate a clear idea for people, because then they can tell right away based on the size or what it's used for by having a person beside it. Of course, the design of the object still has to make sense. You can't just put a person beside something that looks very random. They all still have to go together, but certainly adding people and figures adds to the story and adds more information that can't be accomplished without having a person to compare it to. And so again, we're in this kind of Arctic tundra, so these soldiers have to be dressed accordingly, even though they're ready for war and for battle. And adding these kind of tunics and capes adds something kinetic because it's flowing or in the wind or in their movement. And that's another key too, because you're working with still images. You want to kind of feign or the idea of movement or a feeling of movement in a still image. And things like capes or tunics flowing in the wind adds to that kind of feel. And as I progress along in this image, you'll see me adding more and more figures and working with figures that are already there and adjusting and changing them, slightly altering them. So again, it's a quick way to get diversity and still get the idea across, and best of both worlds, because you're making use of art that you've already constructed, but you're not keeping everything too repetitive either, because that will pull the viewer out. Even simply adjusting the angle of a gun or a leg or a torso, whatever it may be, may be enough of a change to indicate a different person in a different pose. And because they're all soldiers, so you can get away with this, it would make sense to all have the same uniform or garb. So it's getting pretty fun at this point in doing this. Again, because you can see as you're working along, the ideas are becoming clearer, and you're becoming more confident, and the farther along you get, you react to more ideas that you couldn't think of earlier because there wasn't enough information. But as I'm building more and more information, there's more to see, therefore there's more opinion to be formed and more to react to, and you'll notice how I'll change and adjust things, or keep up with one idea but push it forward. Earlier, if you remember, I had scaled this down because I felt like the image needed to be bigger and more scope and scale. And a lot of times it's kind of going back to familiar territory. Even though I laid down some of these tones earlier and I've pushed them back, it's kind of just adding to the information that was there and getting a little more specific. Whereas I may have a general blockiness for a certain shadow earlier, when I push that back, that becomes kind of a secondary shadow, and now adding these new shadows that are more specific in shape but still very fluid and random. It adds another dimension of depth and detail that's implied in the image. That's the key, is implied information. You don't want to get too lost on being very specific, especially for early concepts. The key is, how can I offer a lot of information in the quickest time possible? And your mind fills in the gaps with enough information. If you do a silhouette of a shape that looks familiar to a gun, and then add some hinted at shadows and highlights, that's enough to imply a lot of detail behind there, because your mind and your eyes will recognize a familiar image. Even in something that's sci-fi, it has characteristics that we recognize, and you can get away. The artist is trying to fool you by hinting at information that's not really there. And so now we're working a little more with the weather and the landscape here, reminding ourselves this is supposed to take place in a kind of an Arctic setting, and so we get that feeling and sense of snow and weather, and the chaos and the aggressiveness of a cold climate. Slowly kind of building up some color, hinting at the rock, and at the sun, and at the dirt, and metal, and that sort of thing. It's helpful to do a value test as well at every stage. And the quick way is just to add a black layer and set it on a saturation on the layer state. And this is especially since when you start to work with color, you want to have and more information gets across, you want to make sure your values are set. Doing a value test is a nice quick way to ensure your image is reading properly. And now we're at this stage of just kind of adding more detail, things that help ground an image, give it more personality as well as scale and genre. Lights are a big thing, right? Anything that signifies some kind of neon or symmetry with lights has a kind of very sleek and futuristic feel, an idea of tech and machinery. And so here you see me adding various lights and within the buildings and within the tanks and the characters even, and that right away with a very simple amount of detail, having these glowing simple lights kind of get across this idea of technology and future and science fiction, that sort of thing. And I just laid down a really quick splatter texture and converted that and changed that to snow, and played with the layer settings like overlay or soft light, and erasing or masking out some of the snow that I didn't need because it gets too busy. So at this point you can get, it's because it's working pretty fast, I can still have the luxury of kind of tweaking and playing around with values and mood, but I'm still working pretty fast with it. I don't at this point kind of slow down, right? You can always kind of keep going and push an idea further to a polish if necessary, but in a lot of cases in development for games or entertainment, because you're trying to produce these things quickly, right? You're not spending weeks on one image. It's more like you know, trying to accomplish at least several within a day. And if that's just a day and you think about a 5-day week, you can really kind of be productive and pull a lot of ideas across, like give a lot of information without having to worry about polish. Because even if I polish this to a cleaner state, it really doesn't alter the idea at all. There's enough information here to get the idea across. And we are pitching this to a publisher or whatever, or to your development team. Following up with any kind of polish or rendering at that point is more about either you have the time and budget to push the idea farther so it's even clearer, or a lot of times it's because it's more to do with promotion and marketing. And usually it's the bigger projects, the bigger companies, the bigger budgets that have the luxury of pushing these images to a final state. But typically for the, you know, the mid-sized game developer or whatever, they don't have as much time and money, so they're trying to again get your biggest bang for buck. You noticed earlier that I kind of revisited the composition, scaling and pulling pieces apart to just kind of add more scale and distance, and again, it's an organic process based on the information that's there. It's like, oh, what can I pull and push and make this idea even in grander and more scope. So adding some more snow. In that case I just did quick random lassoed shapes and blurred them out and then erased and painted where I needed to touch it up. Again, a very quick and fluid process. And so at this point I'm pretty happy with where it's going. Playing with hue and saturation and contrast again, just to kind of push back some of the details and push forward things that are closer to us. A really quick way to do contrast, especially the farther along you are in the painting, is just to duplicate the layers and set them on screen if you want something lighter, or multiply for something darker. Put a mask on it and then start to paint back those areas to punch it up. So things like the soldiers were getting kind of lost against the tank, so you noticed I pushed the tank a bit on a screen setting and make it whiter. Some quick shortcuts just to get those ideas across. I just put my signature, and there we go with more or less the idea that I'm trying to get across. So I hope you enjoyed it, I hope it was helpful, and keep practicing, keep painting, and above all, have fun. Bye-bye.